Hello, everybody. Jacob Jantz here with Writing Launch. Thank you for being here today. I'm really happy to be presenting Ian Chandler, who will be giving a brand new presentation all about the 5 actions that every new freelance writer should take when they're getting started, just so that you can launch your career on the right setting and give yourself a good trajectory. Before, just a few minutes ago, Ian was saying how a lot of people new to freelance writing, they don't quite know what the best step is forward, how to take your initial steps into the world of freelance writing. And there's a lot of pitfalls and like wrong ways you can go. And we want to save you time, basically. So this lecture that Ian will be presenting will save you a lot of time and really get you thinking about how you want to design your writing career in a way that suits you the best, and also in a way that's practical and is realistic. You want to have that combination of practical and really something that will work for you and be meaningful to you. So I'm really happy that Ian will be giving this lecture today. And you should also know that if you're interested in joining Writing Launch for free, we are offering a free month of membership, and we're giving a lot of resources for free in terms of what you're going to learn today. So like if you'll be able to explore our database of over 1,900 publishers that pay writers. You could take our course that teaches you exactly how to pitch those publications. You can take our No BS course, which is a very in-depth course on how to launch your freelance writing career and covers everything you need to know in terms of setting rates, finding clients, establishing a system to actually get a sustainable income. Obviously, Ian can only cover a little bit of that in the next 45 minutes or so. So hopefully you'll learn a lot in this presentation. It's going to be great. And then if you want to continue and really build a long-term successful freelance writing career, you're welcome to join us for the free month of membership. Your first month will be free if you join. So without further ado, thank you everyone for being here. And hi, Ian. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you for the introduction, Jacob. You always have the best introductions in the business. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for making it today, or if you're watching the replay, hello from the past. What Jacob said about saving you time is really kind of the core of this presentation, because I talk with a lot of freelance writers who are brand new to it. They don't have experience. They don't have anything published. They know how to write, but that's sort of it. And so I often help these writers get started, and that's what I wanted to do the presentation on today. And if you've seen our webinars in the past, this is going to be a little something different. Some of our other webinars are sort of more encompassing in terms of the scope. Other ones address different topics, but I thought a really good one, because we know there are so many new freelance writers and people who are just interested in it. We thought it'd be a good idea to just give the first 5 steps you should take if you're brand new to freelance writing. And so that's what it's going to be. And let's get into the presentation itself. So yeah, this is just 5 simple steps to starting. And I really do think every new freelance writer should take these actions. And we've set them in this order for a reason, but if you want to, you can sort of experiment with skipping around. The one thing I will say about this is, if you downloaded the checklist that we sent out the other day via email, definitely pull that up, because you'll be able to use the information you learned today to fill that out if you haven't filled it out already. And that will just give you a better idea of where you want to start, what your next steps are, things like that. It's going to be really useful, I think, especially if you're just, like I said, either interested in it and sort of want to explore it, or if you're just getting started and you have an idea of what to do, but you're just not sure which specific actions to take. So that's what we're going to be talking about. And first, let's just look at those 5 steps at a glance. The first one is defining your desired outcomes. And this is a little bit like setting goals, but it has to do more with just thinking about desired results that you want to achieve by becoming a freelance writer. Step 2 is to choose and research a niche. Obviously, you want a topic area to write in. And so we're going to be talking about how to choose one. And there are some really important tips in here. Step 3 is creating your brand, which is kind of a fancy way of saying know who you are as a writer, know what your value is. And as with some of our other content, we're going to be really focusing on value because that's the most important thing there. Step 4 is to approach a potential client, which is it is one of the first 5 steps I think everybody should do, even if you feel you're not ready. And we'll talk about that more when we get to that point. And step 5 is to get your first failure, which is a step that I'm very excited about talking about. And I'll show you why that's the 5th step once we get there. But for now, let's go in order. Step 1, define your desired outcomes. And like I said, there is that checklist. There's a little spot on the checklist for these. For this section. So if you follow through with this section and you get a better idea of some of the outcomes, go ahead and write them down on the checklist. And it would also be cool if you could share those in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so, and maybe see what other people are saying, and then submit your own. And hopefully there will be some interesting learning experiences that way. But let's talk about what even these desired outcomes could be and why they're important. In a nutshell, defining your outcomes provides direction, because once you have an idea of where you want to go, then you'll have a better chance of getting there. It's a lot like traveling in that way. If you know where you're going, you have a route to get there. If you don't know where you're going, you don't know where you're going to end up. And so the corollary of this is that if you have no outcomes in mind, you're going to have no direction. And this is a big reason why a lot of beginners at pretty much anything get stuck, because they don't have any sort of outcome they want to achieve. And that is important at the start, because you might be thinking, okay, well, I want to experiment a little bit at the start. The whole point of me being new to this is that I don't know. But if you can even just entertain some possibilities, that's a lot better than just not knowing what to do at all. Because even if you have the foggiest idea of where you might want to end up, or one goal you might want to achieve, that's going to help guide everything else that you do. Whereas if you don't have any goal, if you don't have any outcomes that you want to achieve, it's going to be a lot harder to take action, because you don't have anything to aim for. So that's ultimately the biggest reason why this is so important. I recommend starting with 2 to 3 outcomes you want to achieve. These don't have to be life-changing outcomes. They don't have to be these huge things. They can be short-term, but I think 2 to 3 is a good number to start with, because you don't want just one, because I feel like that could maybe trap you in terms of, if you just have one thing you want to achieve, then you're going to be doing everything to achieve that one goal. Whereas it's a little more realistic, and it's more helpful if you have kind of 2 to 3 to aim for, because then you can take different actions, you can learn more. And of course, it might be the case that you don't even end up accomplishing these outcomes. You may even change your mind. So it's good to have some flexibility in terms of how many you have. And it is good to think both short-term and long-term. I think when freelance writers start out, they either think one way or the other exclusively. So let's take one writer who, wants to get started making money because they need to make rent in a month or something like that. And so that's a very short-term thing. And even though that's a pressing issue, it makes them neglect the long term. So they might take actions in the short term that kind of sabotage them for the long term. Now, on the other hand, let's say you have someone who's just sort of interested in freelance writing, and they start off saying, okay, well, it would be great to be, a professional writer someday. And of course, as we'll talk about that later, but there's not really, a benchmark for what professional writer means. So that's not very helpful. But then also, if you don't have a concrete goal, it's hard to get there. When are you a professional writer? What does that mean? You have to break it down. And then if you think too long-term like that, it can make you ignore the steps to take immediately. So you won't know how to get to that. You'll have a goal, but you won't have a path to that goal. So that's why it's good to, I think, mix kind of short-term and long-term outcomes together. And you want to clearly and specifically define these outcomes. I can't stress this enough. One, and this is funny, because as writers, we're supposed to be fairly detailed with the way we express things. But for some reason, whenever I talk to writers who are kind of either starting out or are newer to freelancing, if I ask them to define their outcomes, they really struggle with that because they're not used to thinking in that way. They're used to thinking in sort of, abstract, sort of big picture ways. And if you want to have success as a freelancer, it really is important to drill down into the specifics of what are these outcomes, how can you achieve them, and the more specific you are, the better. And if you can really be, excruciatingly detailed, that's going to help you more than just a general outcome. Part of the reason you want to be specific is because your outcomes have to be trackable. And this goes back to what I was just saying. You need to know if you've accomplished the outcome or not, because if you don't know, if you can't track that or measure that in any way, it's practically useless. And again, with that example of I want to be a professional writer. Okay, well, what does that mean? Because there's no title of professional writer that you can achieve. You can't be certified as a professional writer, for instance. It's not like an official job title you have. So what does that mean? That can't be tracked because it doesn't really exist. But if you say, okay, I want to, make X dollars a month as a writer and be published X times a month, then you have those trackable goals. And you get closer to the core of what you mean by that, I want to be a professional writer. So that's really, really important. And we'll talk about these goals later on and how to set them. But, for now, remember to be specific. And again, the more specific you are, the more it will help you. Just as I said, you have to know whether you've achieved that goal. And this gets into something called SMART goals. If you have not heard of this, it's a really good framework for setting goals. And SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And these are all qualities that your goals should have. Specific meaning, again, you're detailed enough. Measurable, like we talked about, meaning that you can track it in some way and you can determine if you've achieved it or not. Achievable means that it is possible for you to do. And this is another thing, is that a lot of goals that writers set are not achievable. Think of a writer who's brand new, who wants to get published in the New York Times. That's not going to happen. I can say with 99.9% certainty that that's not going to happen. And that doesn't mean that the writer is not good enough to. It just means that right now there's no way that you can make that connection because you have no experience. You have you probably don't have the skill set just yet to do that. You don't have the connections. You don't have the strategies. You basically lack all of the tools to accomplish that goal. So that's an example of a goal that's not really achievable. So it does matter whether the goal is achievable or not. And of course, relevant means not only relevant to who you are as a writer, but it has to make sense in the context of your long-term goals and your overall career trajectory. And time-bound just means that it has to be linked to a certain frame of time. And this can be manifested in different ways. And I'll show some examples so you can get an idea of what this looks like. So here's a good example. Let's say you want to make $1,000 a month as a freelance writer by July. Now that's a really specific thing. And as we go through the SMART criteria here, it is specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's relevant, and it's time bound. It hits all of those. The specific is just in the detail it goes in, saying all of this and, saying I want to make this much a month as a freelance writer by this time. That's a really good specific goal. Measurable, well, obviously there's a figure here, $1,000 a month. And we'll kind of skip around to the time bound aspect. It's by July. So you have a certain number of months to achieve this goal. And I think it is achievable because that $1,000 a month level is not too high. It's definitely possible to achieve. I think it would take a lot of work, but it definitely is possible. And then relevant, obviously making a steady income as a writer is relevant to most freelance writers. And I think in the context of this example, it makes sense. So this goal meets all of those SMART criteria. Now, again, that's just sort of a framework for setting goals. So you don't have to use that every time, but I think it provides a really good framework for thinking about goal setting. And then once you've used it enough, I think you'll naturally find that the goals you set will have more of those qualities. Now, here's a bad example. And this is something that I see quite a lot is people saying things like, I want to tell stories that help people find their place. And, I think from a sort of artistic level, this kind of makes sense. But, again, in freelancing, it really is important to set specific goals because that's what your livelihood is going to be determined on and ultimately your success. So the reason this is not great is that it fails that SMART criteria. It's not specific, measurable, achievable, or time bound. In fact, the only criterion that it meets is the relevant part. But this is not very specific at all. It can be interpreted in so many ways. It's not measurable because there's nothing here to measure. How do you measure whether you've helped someone find their place or whatever? How do you measure that part of it? Achievable, I think it's not achievable because it's not clear enough. And this is something you'll see as the SMART criteria kind of depend on each other. So if something's not specific or measurable, it probably is not achievable because there's no way of knowing if you've accomplished it or not. And of course, it's not time bound because there's no sort of time frame associated with this. So that's a bad example. That's a bad example of an outcome. And here's another one, I want to make a living from writing. And this is sort of like that professional writer example that I mentioned. But again, this is not specific or time bound. It gives you a general idea of what the goal is, but it does not drill down into the specifics. And so that's really where the weakness of this is. Now, once you've gotten all of that done, and again, if you have if you're a checklist with you, feel free to fill that out and share it in the chat or in the comments. Once you've gotten some outcomes finished and you're comfortable with them and you think they're good and they meet the SMART criteria, then you can kind of minimize your scope a little bit and think, okay, what niche do I want to work in? So this is where it comes to choosing and researching a niche. Now, this is often one of the harder parts for new freelance writers. Typically what I see is people who say either, oh, I don't have any idea, I just don't know, or I have too many interests. And I think the tips that I'll share will help in terms of that, because it's not really about focusing on interest as much as you think it is. So we'll dive into that. And again, this is also on the checklist. So if you want to fill this out as we're going along, be my guest. First of all, I just want to explain what a niche is, because if you're brand new to freelance writing, you may not know. The definition I'm using here is a focused topic area that you want to write about. That's simply it. It is worth mentioning that they are typically quite specific, and the word niche often gets used to mean small, but really it just means a category. That said, they are quite specific because general subject areas are kind of too vague to be helpful. If you just say, oh, writing in finance, well, there are so many aspects of finance that it's almost like there are all these different worlds and subcategories in between, in that category. And so one can be totally different from another and require a whole different skill set. So it really does help to be specific. One example is, compare mental health, which is sort of a general subject area, with workplace depression. Now that's a niche. That's very specific. That addresses one facet of the bigger category. And if you search these terms in a search engine, you'll see that mental health brings up all kinds of results. But workplace depression brings up far fewer results, and they're a lot more targeted. You can tell they're all about the same exact topic. They kind of hit the same notes. And so that's a great example of a subject area versus a niche. And something I've seen before, there's this confusion that a niche can be a type of writing, and at least that's not how I use the word. I think it's helpful to think of them as two separate things. So for example, gardening is a niche, but article writing is not, because article writing is just a type of writing. You can write articles for just about any niche. It's not a niche in and of itself. Whereas gardening is, a more focused subject area within a bigger subject area. Now, this is the part that might confuse a lot of you at first, but stick with me. You don't want to choose a niche based only on your interests. And this is another mistake that I tend to see beginner freelance writers making, is they think, okay, what am I interested in? I want to write about that. And that's basically the process, is they just go from their interests to the niche. Now, there are some problems with this. that I'm going to go into, but it's important to keep in mind like what the process of selecting a niche is and why it's important. Because a good niche equals passion plus profitability plus practicality. And that's just, again, this is not just based on your interest. There are other factors that are involved in here because, of course, you have to make sure that there is some way to make money from this niche and that you can also make sense with your goals. So the passion part of this is, are you interested in it? That is an important part. And do you have experience in it? That's a slightly different question because a lot of people are interested in things they may not have direct experience in, but it does help to have experience in the niche, or at least, if you read a lot of content in that niche about the topic, that kind of qualifies too. But it helps to have some familiarity with the niche you're going into. If you are just vaguely interested in something and you're like, okay, I want to go with that, but I don't know the niche at all, I don't know anything about the topic really, I just know about it. Of course, that's a really kind of weak foundation to build your writing career on. But on the other hand, let's say you've played drums for 30 years and you know everything about drums and you're very passionate about it. That's a niche that you could write in because you have experience in it. Maybe you've never been a professional drummer, just as a hobbyist, but that still stands. That experience will help you, and it compounds with your interest. So you're interested in it, and you have experience in it. That's sort of the best combination there. And of course, profitability is important because a lot of freelance writers, when they start out, they either think too much about money or not enough. If they're like pressed to pay bills, they're going to think about nothing but just getting whatever money they can. And other writers just don't think about it at all because it sort of seems, just something they're not really concerned with. But it is something you should kind of keep in that middle, Goldilocks category or territory rather. So you have to think about things like, is there a market for this niche, for this type of content? Is there already a lot of content in the niche? Because that's going to determine whether the niche is profitable. If there is almost no content in this niche, it's probably not going to be profitable for you. And I know that kind of doesn't make sense because you might think, oh, well, this niche doesn't have any content. I can just write a ton. There's a need for it. And generally what I find is that's not correlated. Usually the niches that have the most demand for new content are niches that already have a ton of content in it because that niche is always growing. And, there's just a constant need for more content. Whereas if there's a niche that has like almost no content, it also means that there's not a need for it because if there were, then you'd see more of it over time. But if that's not happening, it means there's no demand. So this is another really important part to think about. And now practicality, this is slightly different from profitability. And this gets into sort of the long-term nature of thinking about a niche, because you have to think about, is it sustainable? Can you accomplish the goals that you want to achieve, those outcomes that we talked about in step one? Can you accomplish those by writing in this niche? And these are questions that even fewer beginner freelancers ask because it just doesn't strike them at first. Again, beginner freelance writers tend to think more short term. So when they think about things like, is it sustainable? They kind of just assume that it is, or they don't think about that at all. So these are the kind of the three things you want to balance when you're looking at a niche. It can't just be something you're interested in, and it can't be just something that there's a market for. It has to really balance all three of these things. Now, when you start out, I recommend identifying just one niche to research. And again, this is something I see a lot is beginner writers who will choose 4, 5, 10 different niches and they just run with them. And it seems to me to be the case where these writers who choose all these niches feel like they can't choose just one. But it's a good thing to do because if you focus on just one, it'll be a much more focused experience. You'll have a targeted idea of where you're going. And now you don't have to stick with that niche, but it is good to just start off focused, start off thinking about one niche and one niche only, because then that just kind of puts everything that you're thinking about through a funnel. And it just helps. It helps provide extra direction. And again, if you've gone through your outcomes, you probably have some good direction, but this is just a way to get more direction and make sure you're staying on the path. And if you don't already know the niche well, which ideally you should, take some time to study it. Read a lot of content in the niche. Actually, do that whether you know the niche well or not. Read a lot of content. I mean, if you're going to write for this niche, or write in this niche rather, you want to have an idea of the existing content that's out there. And you want to ask questions like, who is the target audience? What do they want? What are they about? What are some common topics that show up in the niche? What are, how are the articles written about these topics? How are the topics covered? In other words, what kinds of products are sold in the niche? What is the lay of the land, so to speak? These are all fantastic questions to ask as you're getting started. And again, you want to study the niche and read existing content in it. So the study and then just sort of getting a wide view, a big picture view of, who is involved, what the topics are, the products are, just getting an idea of the niche as a whole, sort of what the culture of the niche is like. And then you do want to read that existing content and ask questions like, what goals does the content attempt to achieve? And this is really important. Look at each piece of content, because each piece of content you're going to read in your life is trying to achieve a goal. Whether it does or not, that's kind of dependent on the reader. But you want to think about the goals it's trying to achieve, because chances are when you write, it's probably going to be the case where you have similar goals to try to achieve. And again, how is the content written? How is it covered? Is there a certain tone that people tend to use? Is it covered in a specific way? Is there a variety? Things like this. Next, once you've done that, you want to create your brand. And this is step 3. And again, with the niche stuff, that's more of an outward focusing thing. This is a sort of inward focusing thing, because you're thinking about, okay, I have an outcomes I want to achieve. I have a niche now. What am I going to do in terms of creating a brand for myself? And again, this is sort of who you are as a writer. The first thing you want to do is think about your identity and value, and especially value, because your brand encompasses quite a few things. It encompasses, your style, your voice, the way that you write, the way that you approach a topic. But it also has to do with value, the value that you provide for the people that you work with and for your readers who are going to ultimately consume the content. This is all really critical stuff to think about. The first question is basically, who are you as a writer? And again, that's sort of an open-ended question, but it's one that it really helps to dig down into. Part of this is, what's your style? What is the way that you write? Can you describe the way that you write in a succinct way? Are you very descriptive and factual? Are you sort of more relatable and casual? What are some adjectives you could use to describe your style? This is good stuff to think about. And then you want to think about the value that you provide. And this is, to me, the most important part of getting started, because if you don't understand the value you provide, how can you expect anyone else to? And furthermore, how can you communicate value if it's not there, if you don't understand it? Because at the end of the day, every freelance writing job you'll get because whoever you're working with has deemed that you're going to add some value to whatever they're trying to do, whether that's, a copy for a client who is going to use that to sell a product, or an article for a publication that's going to use that to, please their readers. You need to think about all of these kind of value chains, but it starts with, what value do you provide? Why should clients and editors work with you? What do you offer that is alluring enough for them to work with you? Why should someone choose you over another writer? And this is not necessarily an answer to competition, but you just want to think about what makes you uniquely positioned to solve the problems that you're trying to solve and to offer the value that you're trying to offer. So again, this is just sort of a guiding question, because I don't think you should, go into a job interview or, go on a call or write an email that says, I'm better than other writers because blank, blank, blank. But you should just have that knowledge of how you're uniquely positioned to provide that sort of value. One thing to do that is really helpful here is to come up with a value proposition, which is essentially a short statement that reflects, in a nutshell, the value that you provide. You want to think about what specific results that you're going to help a client and editor achieve. Again, as with the SMART goals, it really pays to be specific here. What benefits will your content provide to the people who read it? The readers who are ultimately going to be the ones who are receiving and hopefully benefiting from the content. So you're kind of looking at two main audiences, or two main receivers, I guess, the client or the editor, and then the audience, because it's important to focus on both, because that's the path that your content goes through. So it's really important to understand, why it's going to be valuable to the client or the editor, and why it's going to be valuable to the readers. Generally, the value to the readers is going to also be the value to the client or the editor, but it is helpful to think about both, because they're sort of you can think about them differently. In other words, the results that you're going to help a client achieve, those are sort of goals that they want to achieve. Whereas the ultimate benefits that the readers will receive are from the content itself. So that, there's kind of two layers to it, but it's good to think about both. And here's an example of a good value proposition. I help single dads figure out how to budget more effectively. Now, again, this kind of hits a lot of those SMART criteria, but it answers these questions of, what value and benefits you provide. Because for the readers, the readers who are single dads, they're going to learn to budget more effectively. For the client, if you look at it through the lens of the client or the editor, this kind of says, okay, I have a portion of my target audience is single dads. I do run a finance website. This is going to hit that box for me. So you can kind of see how we're thinking about the two layers at the same time. And this is great because this value proposition addresses the audience and the benefits that they're going to receive. Another good example is I work with food startups to create social media content that drives clicks. And this one is a little more focused on the business side of things, because you can see the goal here is to drive clicks from social media. So this is more focused on that business side of things. But let's look at a bad one. I work with small businesses to create helpful content. This is bad because it's vague and it doesn't talk about any results at all. No results, no benefits, no value. What does it mean to create helpful content? What is helpful content? In that first example, the helpfulness came from helping people figure out how to budget more effectively. That was very clear. In this, if you just say, I want to create helpful content, that means almost nothing, because you don't have any examples or descriptions to back that up. And, small businesses, that's a pretty wide range of businesses. So again, you can see how, as with some of the bad outcomes we looked at earlier, this just doesn't make sense because it's not specific. It's not helpful at all. And it also does not address the audience. It doesn't really address the business side of things or the reader side of things. It kind of addresses the business side because you're saying you work with small businesses, but there's no semblance of value here. Now for the next step, which is approach a potential client. Because after you've kind of solidified your brand, you say, okay, I know what I'm about. I know my niche. One of the next things to do is to approach a potential client. Even if you think that you're not going to get a yes, that's not really the point at this stage. The point is to take action. And when we look at step 5, we'll talk about this more. But for now, let's talk about how you can approach a potential client. Once you've identified your niche and solidified your brand, you do want to pretty quickly start looking for potential clients within your niche. And again, this is a good way to just do research on the niche in general, because if you're going to be working with these kinds of people anyway, it's a good idea to have a knowledge of them. And most of the time, you're going to be seeking out either publications or businesses. Those are typically the two kind of schools that freelance writers fall into. I do recommend doing both, especially when you're starting out, because working with both types of client will help you so much. If I had just stuck to one, I think I wouldn't have grown as much as I did. And that's what I see in other writers too. So I do recommend checking both publications and businesses when you're looking for clients. The key differences here are that publications hire writers for articles, usually on an article by article basis. So nothing's kind of promised. It's all one-off work. whereas businesses will hire writers for all kinds of work, not just articles. And this can be one-off or ongoing. So, if you work with a business, sort of a private client, as opposed to a publication, you might get ongoing work, and, you might be able to get referrals and, a repeat customer. And there's all these potentials that really you can't get with publications, but publications tend to be more flexible. So there is a balance here to hit. And this is why I recommend looking at both. But those are sort of the key differences between them. Now, in terms of actually finding these publications and businesses, you can find them either through just learning organically about the niche, as we talked about in step 2, researching the niche. You might just find a lot of these businesses or publications naturally in your research. Of course, you can also use targeted searching. If you have seen some of our past webinars, we talk about specific searching techniques to use. If you haven't seen that, you can look at them on our YouTube channel. But it's just the idea of, using a search engine to run targeted searches for specific types of publications or businesses that are looking for writers. For publications, we do recommend using our paid publishing guidebook if you have that. If not, I think we may be sending it out, but I'm not entirely sure on that. But anyway, this is a fantastic resource. And actually, if you end up joining Writing Launch, and again, you'll get your first month free, if you use the code, and we'll talk about that at the end. But if you do join up, we have a paid publishers database that I think has over 1,900 right now. We're getting closer to 2,000. All these different publications that pay writers, and they pay pretty well. We try to not put a lot of super low paying publications in there. And this is a great resource that puts everything at your fingertips. And another way to search for these is, as I alluded to, using key phrases on search engines. And again, we have information in our previous webinars about that if you want to check that out on our YouTube. For looking for businesses, one way is to look for job postings. This is a great way to learn about some different businesses in the niche, and especially businesses that are hiring, because it's kind of one thing to learn about the general companies that are going to be in a niche. It's another to look at the ones and find out about the ones that are hiring and that are sort of probably smaller, but open to hiring writers and who just need writers, as opposed to, huge businesses that sort of hire based on referrals, or kind of they stay in-house. You can also just browse social media. And again, this sort of goes together with the organic learning we talked about. You can often find a lot of companies that way, and you can even find job postings on social media. So those are a few ways to look for them. And again, we talk about that more in depth in our courses and our presentations on YouTube. But we also have the No BS course, which is our sort of flagship course. And we go really into detail on how to create a job seeking system. So if you're interested in that, definitely sign up. We'll give the details about that in a minute. But first, I want to address the final step, which is getting your first failure. Jacob and I recently were, designing this webinar, and we were thinking, okay, what are the 5 steps going to be? And I was thinking back to, my experience, and I was thinking about, what we teach people. And it occurred to me that, a lot of people are afraid to fail, but that is one of the most integral parts of starting out as a freelance writer. And in fact, a lot of our content, like if you join the courses, in the courses, you'll see a lot of kind of what to do if you fail, or, it almost accounts for failure. And so I wanted to talk about that because this is a really critical part of starting out. The bottom line is that failures are learning opportunities. A lot of people are afraid to fail, obviously, and I think that's a natural fear. But it is something that you're going to have to overcome if you want to succeed as a freelance writer, because they are learning opportunities. And in fact, they're usually more useful than successes because they teach you how to improve. They show you if you've had a shortcoming somewhere, or if your process just isn't working, and they help you pivot. And yeah, like I said, they usually teach you more than successes do, at least in my experience. And I mean, I've seen this with other writers too. Successes are nice and they feel good, but they don't tend to teach you all that much except for what you're doing worked, which is, that's a good thing to know. But failures tend to help you figure out how to succeed more reliably, because now you know what not to do, and you can sort of eliminate that and then narrow down what to do. And if you can learn from your failures and make changes based on those, you're going to be more likely to succeed. That's just the bottom line. And again, this kind of sounds really basic, but when you start out and when you actually come to your first failure, it feels a lot different. It feels disencouraging. It feels really just, you feel powerless and you feel like you just want to give up. So it's easy to talk about this stuff conceptually, but when you are in the moment really, failing and sometimes failing hard, it can be tough to deal with this. And this is why we're talking about this, because it's so crucial to build up the right mindset for dealing with failures. And seeing them as learning opportunities means that even the severe ones are going to be tolerable, because really bad failures just means that you can learn more from them. One other mistake that I see a lot is people correlating failure with confidence. Now, and this is interesting because we all know that everyone fails. We know that's a human thing. At the same time, we link failure with confidence and we say, okay, if I fail, that means I'm not good enough. But that doesn't make sense, because literally every human ever has failed and will fail and does fail. So, that's sort of, I think, a logical versus emotional battle that can be hard to reconcile. But when it comes down to it, you need to realize that failure does not always say something about, the person who failed. It can, for sure, but it can also just mean that the circumstances weren't right, that, that your process wasn't right. Something in there needs to be changed and improved, but it doesn't say anything about who you are as a writer. And again, that feels very basic and almost cliche to say, but when you see how many writers struggle with this, it becomes evident as to why we're talking about this. And in fact, I think you need to learn to fail confidently. And the way to do that is just to look to the future and ask, okay, what's next? What did I learn from that failure? What can I change? How do I move forward? And just using that as a launch pad to propel you into the next stage, rather than, staying kind of simmering in your own self-pity, because that can be really tempting to do. And of course, I've done that lots before, but it's really important to just look to the future and, again, use that as a launch pad to set you forward. This seems like simple stuff, but I can't stress how important this mindset is. And I'll just list some possible first failures so you can get an idea of, what they might be and how to deal with them. So let's say you send out a pitch and you don't get a response back. And let's say that's from step 4. So step 4, you approach a potential client, a publication that you want to work with. You've sent out a pitch and you just have gotten nothing back. You didn't even get a no back. You just got nothing back. So some possible actions to take from here are, okay, first, let me follow up. If I haven't done that, I'll see if maybe they just missed it or, something happened. If it's only been a couple of weeks, that's a good time to follow up. If you hear nothing back at all, and either you don't follow up or you do and hear nothing, you really want to analyze and troubleshoot your pitch and your approach. You need to ask questions like, okay, what publication was I trying to pitch to? Are they busy right now? Is their editorial department really slammed with a lot of pitches? Do they just not need this content? Was what I pitched really fitting enough for them? And I don't want you to think in terms of good enough, but just, was it fitting? Because, let's say you pitched an idea about how to save money during Christmas, but you pitched this during the summer. Obviously that's not going to fit, because it's not what the publication needs at that moment. They need that closer to Christmas. So this is a good way to analyze and say, okay, where might I have gone wrong here? Where didn't things line up? And this is a really important thing to be able to learn to do, is just to analyze your pitches and find out not even where they went wrong, but just where they missed the mark in terms of not lining up with the expectations of the publication or the client. Now, let's say another first failure could be you lose a job because the client doesn't want to pay what you're asking. So let's say you approach a client and you've seen a job posting, you respond, you're like, hey, I think I'm good for this. And they respond, great, you're in for the job, we can pay you this much. And it is not anywhere close to what you're asking. It might be 10% as much or something like that. And you say no, because obviously you're worth more than that. So some potential next steps from here are look for higher paying clients, obviously, and kind of make that a priority in terms of figuring out that first and then going forward with more. And also just looking for clients who state their budget outright. That can be a really easy way of avoiding that problem. But as you can see, all of these next steps are dependent on the failures, and they allow you to improve your process in a way that you couldn't have if you had not failed. So again, this is really important, thinking about not only accepting your failures, but using them as tools. And you're going to be doing that for so long. I mean, I still do it. I'm kind of 7, 8 years in as a freelance writer, and I still do that so often. This is also a good thing to just learn for life in general, but it's really, really applicable to freelance writing. And again, since you're going to be failing a lot, you need to make the best of it, and you need to turn those failures into tools. So that's the 5th step. And again, think about some failures that you might run into and how to deal with those. Based on your goals, based on your brand, your niche, the clients you're going to approach, what are some failures that you could run into? What's a possible first failure for you? How could you deal with that? How could you turn that into a tool to improve your career? So that's the kind of stuff you want to be thinking about. That does it for the main body of the webinar, but I do want to have a Q&A real quick. So if you have questions about anything that I mentioned or any questions about writing launch, feel free to ask them, and we'll get around to as many as we can. And again, talking about that free offer, if you sign up for Writing Launch today, you'll get your first month absolutely free. You use coupon code FREE at checkout at writinglaunch.com. We want to make sure that this is accessible to as many people as possible. And if you liked what you saw today, you are going to love the courses that we have. We recommend everyone check out the No BS course on freelance writing, which is our flagship course. And it goes into detail on all of these. So the first week of the No BS course is a lot of this, but in more detail. So again, if you like this, I think you're really going to enjoy what we have to offer. And I hope you join us, and I hope we can hear from you soon. And again, if you have any questions, let us know, and we'll get to as many as we can in the next 12 minutes or so.
Thank you, Ian. That was great. And anyone, if you have any questions, post them in the chat, and I will relay them to Ian. Karen asks, is it an idea to take a first lower paying publication and then use that as a clip for your portfolio?
It all depends. I mean, the thinking about rate is a sort of different question, because that is something you want to think about, but it's sort of, that falls into your brand a little bit too. Of course, we didn't discuss that in this webinar because it would take far too long. If you join, we actually have a masterclass on setting rates that I think would be very helpful. But it really has to do with what those outcomes are that we talked about. If your outcome is to make X amount of dollars with your first job, that's a very simple example. Let's say you want to make $200 with your first job, and you get an offer that's, $125 or something like that. It really is up to you as to how much you want to compromise those goals. And I'm a big believer in always trying to achieve your goals exactly, if not pretty close to exactly, because the more that you compromise, the more you're kind of setting yourself up for failure in the future. But it really just depends. I've had some people write for free to start out with, or just take high paying jobs right off the bat. It is possible to get paid really well off the bat, and that's sort of what I encourage. If you're having problems with that, I think there are ways you can troubleshoot that, and we go over some of that in our courses. But I think it's better to aim realistically high, when you're starting out. Like, don't aim for the New York Times or to be making $1,000 per piece or something like that. Don't aim that high, but aim higher than, okay, well, I have to work for free. I have to go on Upwork. I have to really scrounge for jobs. It needs to be kind of somewhere in the middle, I think.
Yeah, that's great. The one thing I think about is I see a lot of writers get stuck on this idea of getting the right payment with their first client. Mm-hmm. So if you find yourself obsessing over that, keep in mind that it's just your first client, and hopefully you'll have dozens or hundreds, many clients over the long period of time. So put your worries about payment rates in the context of your longer term career, and it takes a lot of the pressure off, right?
Yeah. Well, this is what we talked about writers kind of not thinking about the long term, because looking back, I would say my first probably 150 jobs that I got or so were all sort of, they almost felt like practice jobs, because I learned so much from them. And then from then on, I could have a more confident approach and I kind of built a system. But those first, 150 were all sort of me learning a lot still. And I didn't really crystallize that knowledge for years. So,
yeah. But that's also learning that we're giving everyone today and everyone who joins Writing Launch. So a lot of why we created Writing Launch was because you had to learn things the hard way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've distilled so much of your knowledge to give people that shortcut so they can learn things a lot faster.
Yeah.
Another question from Clinton: how do you avoid clients who might just want to scam you?
Well, there's a few different ways that can happen. I mean, looking back at step 4, I think part of approaching clients and researching them means doing your homework on them and doing your homework on just types of clients in general. And actually, there's a lesson in, I think, the NoBS course where we go over warning signs and sort of red flags to look out for. But I mean, you can sort of get a general idea. As long as you do your research on the company and it's all good, I think you're probably going to be okay. The other thing is just to don't be desperate for jobs, because that's often where I see people getting scammed is, okay, I really need a job. I'm just looking at this job posting. I'm going to respond without researching them or without really thinking about the job, without analyzing the posting, because there are some red flags you can look for. Like if it's not written well, that's sort of one red flag. If, depending on the contact information, that can be another, but overall, it has to do with how much research you put into each client, I would say.
So a lot of people seem to be asking about rates. And when you're getting started, what should be like the very bottom rate? Like say, Lubov, sorry if I said your name wrong. Lubov asked, what's a realistic payment we should ask for an article that is 1,000 words?
One of the reasons that I didn't want to talk about rates in the webinar was because it's so complicated. Because I would have to address each of you individually, or I would have to give a formula that each of you could fill out. And again, if you're interested in that, join up, get your first month free, look at the rate setting masterclass, because we go into everything from figuring out how much you need to, what competitive rates are, and looking at the industry, all of that stuff. It's in there. It's about an hour long, and I think it's an hour well spent, because essentially what you have to do is figure out how much you need to make, depending on your situation. Do you want to do this full-time or part-time? How many people do you need to be making money for? Is this your only job? Do you have other jobs? There are so many factors that factor into this. And so that's sort of where you can base that lowest payment off of. It really it depends on a lot of those factors. So I wish I had time to address it here, but I don't. So again, that's sort of the best answer I can give you, is just join up and watch the masterclass on that.
I think it really goes back to that first step that you presented in the webinar of setting your outcomes. And if you have a really clear idea of your outcomes, that will help you answer the question of what is the appropriate rate for you to charge. And I think one thing to keep in mind with all of those steps is you should be going back and thinking about your niche in more detail and your outcomes in more detail as you progress further in your careers. I think most people who have successful careers, they're constantly thinking about those fundamental things in terms of how they guide their own path forward. So don't just think about your outcomes once. That's just something you want to continually refine, right? And then you'll have continually better answers for the question of what your rate should be.
Yeah, absolutely.
So somebody asked about advising on trying to sell columns with the goal of eventually syndicating. I don't think you have much experience in terms of journalism and specifically syndicating articles.
Yeah. journalism is technically a different beast from freelance writing. Um, and it gets confusing because a lot of the publications that are available to freelance writers are also available to journalists. But there is sort of a line between freelance writing and freelance journalism. And I have zero journalism experience aside from being on my high school and college paper. That's it, so I don't have, any experience there. So sorry, I can't help with that.
Um, I have a little more experience through running Freedom with Writing. I interact with a lot of editors and journalists.
Mhm.
I would say that I don't really have a good answer in terms of syndicating, but it seems to me you would want to build relationships with editors and get established in terms of getting your name out there, getting published in the types of publications that do syndicate. It takes your time to build a career. I don't really have an understanding of like who offers syndication, but you would definitely want to just go down that route of building relationships with editors and getting published with those editors, and eventually your name will get out there, and you'll also learn your niche more specifically in terms of where those syndication opportunities are in your niche, because there are many different types of syndication, right? So you want to learn the ones that are specific to what you're aiming for. Hopefully that was a helpful answer to your question. What do you, so Alan asked a great question. I'm trying to build a multi-income stream situation where freelancing, at least initially, would be about 20 to 30 hours a week.
Mhm.
Will I be at a real handicap if I'm not going at it full time?
No, I mean, well, I actually, I guess it depends because it depends on how proportionally how much you want freelancing to sort of make up your total income. Because full time allows you to focus on it more for sure, but it's the kind of thing where you can scale up or down as you need. The only thing is that if you're going to do it part time, you need to really define the parameters of what part time means to you, which includes, again, how many hours you're working, like you said, how much money you want to make, how many hours that you can find yourself working maybe per day, even because I think weekly and per day hours can sort of fluctuate. You might find yourself having 6 hours free some days, maybe just 1 hour free some other days. And so understanding how to break that up and, how much time you'll have, how you'll spend your time, are you going to spend a lot of it researching? You probably will. So how can you account for that? Plan how much time you're going to spend on the writing itself. Whether you're going full-time or part-time, really you can make both work. You have to make sure to understand and define the parameters of each one. Because if you don't, I think that's when things can get a little messy. Your work-life balance can kind of go off kilter, and you can also just tend to lose direction.
Yeah, I would say that if you want to, if you know your income goals, and you get to learn your niche, and you go through all these steps that you need for success, there's a process to follow with that, and the amount of time you dedicate to that process will determine how quickly you get there, among a few other factors. But you may decide that you want to go through it really quickly, which means putting in more hours, or you may want to go through that process more slowly, which means maybe you'll get to your desired outcomes a little later. I'm someone that always has a lot of different projects happening. So I know a lot about what Ian was saying about the work-life balance. So there's pros and cons to the multi-income stream thing. One of the pros is that if you do it well, you have more stability because you have all of these new things coming online that, if something isn't working great, another one will. One of the cons is it's hard to do really, really well in one area if you're constantly being pulled to another area. So often what I do is I decide, okay, this project is going to get all of my creative energy, and the other ones I'm just going to make sure they're functioning. And so you want to switch back and forth in that way. You may want to be full-time freelancing for a few weeks or however long you want, and then you get that set up so it's going smoothly, and then you can switch your energy to another thing to get that other thing set up going smoothly. Hopefully that's helpful insight as well. We're just about out of time, but let me ask maybe one or two more questions.
Mm-hmm.
Lunga asked, what is the general preference between long and short articles or opinion pieces? It seems to me that's really like something you'll learn as you get to learn your niche. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, mostly, this is sort of a tangent, but I will say opinion pieces specifically are sort of not, I don't want to say they don't exist anymore, but they're less common because a lot of the ways that we have defined content over the last 10 or 15 years have changed so dramatically, and, whereas maybe 30 years ago, you had things like, syndicated newspaper columns, opinion pieces, sort of just all the parts that made up a newspaper. Today, the lines are so blurred and they overlap and there's new types. So that part comes down to studying your niche and figuring out, okay, what types of content are in the niche. As far as long versus short, what you said, Jacob, was generally correct. There is a different way of looking at it, which is sort of content preferences over the last 10 or so years, because from an SEO standpoint of search engine optimization, generally long articles tend to do better. And so there has been sort of a greater preference toward longer articles. That's what I mostly write. And, by long form, I'm talking like 1,500 or up, which is kind of a loose definition. Some people consider to be, 3,000 words or more, but it generally starts at about the 1,500 to 2,000 word mark. And there is sort of a general predilection these days for that type of content. And even if you are in a niche where it's mostly shorter content, I think it definitely behooves you to at least learn how to write both types, so that way you're well armed for whatever the case may be.
I think we're out of time, but for those who have more questions for us, you can join Writing Launch for free, and we'll just keep answering all of your questions as long as you ask them. So it's kind of an incredible offer for those who take advantage of it, the free month of membership. You get your first month free, and we're just going to give as much value as we can during that month, and you can just keep working with us and asking your questions and taking our courses and using our resources. We have just a lot of value that we're giving. It frankly seems a little crazy that we're giving it for free.
You're right, because you can email us, you can comment on the lessons. I mean, we call it unlimited email coaching because that's basically what it is. For as long as you're a member, you get priority support, and it's just Jacob and I, running everything, responding to your comments and questions personally. We really do our best to try to tailor everything for each individual student.
And we also have monthly live Zoom meetings, so you can just talk to us in person via Zoom, with a small group. For those of you who are interested in joining Writing Launch, you can get your first month free. That's free as in $0, by using the coupon code FREE. And yeah, that's it. And I hope you've gotten a lot of value out of today. And I hope we can look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you, everyone, so much for being here.